In a world where everyone is sharing, why do some people choose to disappear? Not completely, not dramatically, just quietly. They don't announce it. They don't explain themselves. They don't make a statement. They simply stop showing up. They scroll, they observe, they read, they watch, but they don't post. They don't broadcast. They don't perform their lives for an audience. And if you're listening to this right now, there's a chance this question isn't abstract for you, because maybe you've felt it. That strange feeling of being present everywhere, yet visible nowhere, of knowing what's happening, but not needing to announce that you were there, of experiencing moments deeply, but feeling no urge to turn them into content. You see people constantly sharing their thoughts, their faces, their meals, their emotions, their victories, even their pain. And something inside you hesitates, not because you don't have anything to say, but because you feel that saying it publicly would somehow cheapen it. So you stay silent, and slowly, subtly, you start to notice something unsettling. The world doesn't ask why you're quiet. It just assumes. It assumes you're shy, or insecure, or antisocial, or disconnected, or hiding something. But none of that feels right, does it? Because silence for you doesn't feel empty. It feels intentional. It feels like standing still in a rushing crowd and realizing you don't actually want to run with them. And that's where the discomfort begins, because when everyone else is visible, being invisible starts to feel suspicious. As if existence itself now requires proof, a photo, a caption, a reaction. And when you don't provide that proof, you start to feel slightly out of place, not rejected, not excluded, just misaligned, like you're tuned to a different frequency. You might have noticed it in conversations too. People talk about things they posted, moments they shared, reactions they received, and you're there, listening, nodding, understanding, but not participating in the same way. Not because you weren't there, but because your experience lives somewhere else, somewhere quieter, and that raises an uncomfortable internal question. Is there something wrong with me? Why don't I feel the need to show myself the way others do? Why does visibility feel exhausting instead of exciting? Why does silence feel safer than exposure? And maybe you've tried to force yourself to fit in. You've posted once or twice, shared something personal, waited, not just for likes, but for that feeling everyone talks about, validation, connection, belonging, and instead you felt oddly detached, like you were watching yourself from the outside. Like the moment no longer belonged to you once it was seen. So you pulled back again, quietly, no drama, no announcement, just absence. And the absence started to feel honest. But honesty has a cost, because in a world that equates presence with worth, silence can start to feel like erasure. You might begin to wonder if people forget about you more easily, if your life feels smaller because it isn't documented, if choosing not to post means choosing to be unseen, and that tension sits there. On one side, the noise, on the other, your inner stillness, and you stand in between, asking yourself questions most people never stop to ask. What is visibility really for? Who am I when no one is watching? And why does being unseen sometimes feel more real than being noticed? This is not about social media alone. This is about identity. Because at some point, you realize that what's happening on the screen is also happening inside your mind. The pressure to explain yourself, to present yourself, to translate your inner world into something consumable. And the resistance you feel isn't laziness or fear, it's friction. The friction between depth and display, between presence and performance. And if you're honest, you've always leaned toward depth. You notice subtleties others miss. You think before you speak. You feel things fully, even when you don't show them. You don't need every moment to be acknowledged to know it mattered. But the world keeps whispering the opposite. If you don't post it, did it happen? If no one saw it, does it count? If no one reacts, Does it exist? And somewhere along the way, that whisper becomes pressure. Pressure to be visible, pressure to be legible, pressure to turn your inner life outward, and your silence begins to feel like resistance. Not loud resistance, not rebellious resistance, but quiet resistance. The kind that doesn't argue. It simply refuses to reduce life into highlights, refuses to package meaning into captions, refuses to let algorithms define identity. And yet, that refusal comes with loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, but the loneliness of being different in a way that's hard to explain. Because how do you explain that silence is not absence for you, but alignment? How do you explain that you're not hiding, you're protecting? How do you explain that you don't want to disappear, you just don't want to perform? And this is where the real question emerges. Not why don't I post, but what does my silence say about how I experience the world? Because silence, when chosen, is never random. It is shaped by perception, by sensitivity, by how deeply someone processes reality. And if you're here, listening to this, there's a strong chance that your silence isn't emptiness at all. It's information. Information about how your mind works, how you relate to meaning, how you define self-worth. And that's what this video is really about. Not social media habits, not trends, not technology, but the psychology behind choosing silence in a world addicted to noise. And as we move forward, we're going to explore what that silence actually reveals about control, about emotional independence, about identity that doesn't need an audience. Because once you understand why some people choose to stay invisible, you'll realize something powerful. They're not disappearing. They're standing somewhere deeper, and most people never even look there. At first glance, silence online looks simple. No posts, no stories, no updates, just absence. But psychologically, it's anything but simple. Because human beings are wired to be seen, to be acknowledged, to receive signals that say, you exist, you matter. So when someone chooses not to participate in a system built entirely on visibility, the question is no longer what they're doing, but why. And the answer begins much earlier than social media itself. From the moment we are young, we learn something subtle but powerful. Approval equals safety. Attention equals value. Being noticed means being accepted. This conditioning doesn't come from the internet. It comes from family dynamics, school environments, peer groups, early emotional experiences. Some people learned early that being loud brought consequences. Others learned that expressing too much emotion led to misunderstanding. Some discovered that staying quiet kept them safer, more in control, less exposed. So silence slowly became a strategy, not avoidance, not weakness, a form of regulation. Psychology calls this self-protective withdrawal. It's what happens when the mind decides, often unconsciously, that visibility carries a cost, and online spaces amplify that cost. Because online, you are not just seen, you are interpreted, filtered, judged without context. A thought becomes a screenshot. A moment becomes a permanent record. A feeling becomes content for strangers. For certain minds, that feels invasive. People who choose silence online tend to share one internal trait. They are highly self-observant. They don't just experience life. They watch themselves experiencing it. They notice shifts in mood. They feel subtle emotional reactions. They sense when something stops feeling authentic. And at some point, many of them realize something unsettling. I am no longer living this moment. I'm preparing to explain it. That's when the fracture happens. Because the moment you start living with an imagined audience, your inner experience changes. You stop asking, how do I feel? And start asking, how will this look? For people with strong introspective tendencies, that split is exhausting. So they step back, not because they hate people, not because they are antisocial, but because they refuse to turn their inner life into a performance, Another layer of this mechanism is emotional autonomy. Many people post because they need emotional regulation from the outside. Likes stabilize mood. Comments reassure identity. Views soften self-doubt. But people who remain silent often regulate internally. They process emotions alone. They reflect before reacting. They sit with discomfort rather than broadcasting it. That doesn't mean they don't feel deeply. It usually means they feel too deeply to make it public. There is also something else at play: a quiet resistance to comparison. Social platforms are built on constant measurement. Who is happier? Who is more successful? Who is more interesting? For some minds, comparison doesn't motivate. It corrodes. So silence becomes a way to opt out of a system that constantly asks, "Where do you rank?" instead of asking, "Who are you becoming?" But here's where it gets complicated. Not everyone who stays silent online is at peace. Some are protecting something fragile. Some are healing. Some are tired of being misunderstood. Some once shared everything and slowly realized they felt emptier each time. Burnout is common here. Emotional burnout from overexposure, from explaining yourself repeatedly, from watching private moments become public property. At some point, the nervous system says enough, and silence feels like relief. Yet silence also creates distance. You stop being visible in other people's narratives. You stop being updated. You become harder to categorize. And in a culture obsessed with constant presence, invisibility can feel like disappearance. This creates an internal tension, a push and pull between wanting to be understood and refusing to be reduced, between connection and control, between expression and preservation. This is where many people get stuck. They don't post, but they still scroll. They observe, they absorb, they think. And over time, this deep observation shapes their inner world even more. They start seeing patterns, performances, contradictions. They realize how much of online behavior is driven by fear of being forgotten. And once you see that clearly, it's hard to unsee. Silence, then, becomes less about hiding and more about choice. A decision to remain undefined, unmeasured, unreduced. But this choice has consequences. It can lead to feeling misunderstood, overlooked, sometimes even lonely. And this is where the paradox begins to form. Because the same silence that protects them also separates them. The same invisibility that grants freedom also creates alienation. And that leads to the deeper question we'll face next. What happens when you stop seeking visibility in a world that rewards it? Why do the people who speak the least online often feel the most disconnected offline? And how does silence slowly turn from refuge into isolation? That's where the paradox lives. And that's where we're going next. At some point, silence stops feeling like freedom and starts feeling like distance. This is the paradox few people talk about. When you step away from visibility, you gain control. But you also lose something subtle. You lose friction with the world. Because visibility, as exhausting as it is, creates contact. It creates reminders, signals of presence. When you disappear online, you are no longer part of the constant mental map people carry of each other. Not because they don't care, but because attention today is sustained by repetition. And this is where many silent people feel a strange contradiction. They don't want attention, yet they feel unseen. They don't want validation, yet they feel disconnected. They don't want to perform, yet they miss being understood. Psychologically, this tension creates what can be called invisible alienation. You are present, but not acknowledged. Alive, but not referenced. Connected, but not mirrored. Human beings don't just need solitude, they need resonance. Someone, somewhere, reflecting back, "I see you." When silence becomes prolonged, that reflection disappears. And the mind starts asking questions it never had to ask before. Am I irrelevant now? Do people remember me? Would anyone notice if I vanished completely? These thoughts don't come from ego. They come from attachment needs that exist in every human nervous system. Even the most independent minds are still social organisms. This is why many people who stay silent online experience a quiet form of loneliness that's hard to explain. They are not isolated physically. They may have jobs, routines, conversations, but there is a lack of symbolic presence, no trace, no footprint. And in a digital world, absence often feels like erasure. Here's the deeper layer. People who choose silence often expect that depth will naturally attract depth, that by not playing the game, others will somehow sense their substance. But the modern world doesn't work on intuition, it works on signals. Silence sends no signal. So the quiet thinker watches others connect loudly, casually, effortlessly, and starts feeling like they exist in a parallel dimension. Not superior, not inferior, just misaligned. This misalignment creates a subtle grief, not the grief of loss, but the grief of not being met. And that grief can slowly turn inward. Some begin to believe something is wrong with them, that they are too complex, too quiet, too intense, too much, or not enough. Others go the opposite direction. They harden, they tell themselves they don't need anyone. They romanticize detachment. They turn silence into armor, but armor protects by separating, and over time, armor becomes isolation. This is the danger point. When silence stops being a choice and becomes an identity, I'm just someone who doesn't share. I don't connect like others. I exist better alone. These statements can be true, but they can also be defenses. Psychology shows that prolonged withdrawal, even voluntary, changes perception. You start interpreting neutrality as rejection, distance as judgment, lack of response as lack of interest, not because people changed, but because your reference points did. This is why some of the most introspective people feel alienated even when surrounded by others. They are living deeply inside, but lightly outside, and the gap between inner depth and outer expression keeps growing. Here's the paradox in its raw form. The same silence that protects authenticity also prevents recognition. The same invisibility that avoids judgment also blocks connection. And the mind begins oscillating. Should I speak more? Should I stay invisible? Is the cost of being seen worth the risk? Is the cost of staying unseen worth the loneliness? There is no simple answer, because this isn't about social media anymore. It's about identity, about whether you exist with the world or beside it. And this is where many people get stuck. They don't want to perform, but they also don't want to disappear. They don't want shallow visibility, but they crave meaningful presence. The mistake is thinking these are mutually exclusive. They're not, but reconciling them requires something most people never learn: intentional visibility, not exposure, not performance, not constant sharing, but conscious expression. And before we go there, there's something crucial we need to clear up, because many people misinterpret what silence should mean. They think the only options are noise or disappearance, oversharing or isolation, performance or withdrawal. That binary thinking keeps them trapped. So before we talk about integration, we need to correct a dangerous misunderstanding. Silence does not automatically mean depth, and visibility does not automatically mean shallowness. The real issue isn't whether you post or not, it's why and what you're protecting and what you're avoiding. That distinction is the key. And that's what we're going to untangle next. Because in the next block, we'll talk about the right kind of silence. Not the silence that hides you, but the silence that strengthens you. Not invisibility as escape, but restraint as power. That's where the shift happens. And that's where silence stops being alienation and becomes alignment. There is a dangerous misunderstanding about silence. Many people believe silence automatically means wisdom, that staying invisible makes them deeper, that withdrawing protects authenticity. Sometimes it does, but other times silence isn't clarity. It's avoidance wearing a calm face, and the difference between the two is subtle but life-changing. The right kind of silence is chosen. The wrong kind is reactive. The right silence comes from inner stability. The wrong one comes from fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of judgment, fear of being exposed, fear of not being enough once seen. Psychologically, these two silences look identical from the outside, but internally, they feel completely different. One feels grounded, the other feels tight. One creates peace, the other creates tension. And if you're honest with yourself, you already know which one you're living in. The problem is that silence can slowly turn into self-erasure if it's not intentional. You stop speaking up, stop expressing opinions, stop sharing insights. Not because you don't have them, but because you're tired of explaining yourself. You tell yourself, it's not worth it. They wouldn't get it. I'd rather keep it to myself. At first, this feels empowering, but over time, something shifts. Your inner world keeps expanding, while your outer world stays small, and that imbalance creates pressure, because humans aren't designed to live entirely inward. Thoughts need air, ideas need friction, meaning needs expression. Without some form of outward release, the mind starts turning on itself. Overthinking intensifies. Self-doubt grows quietly. Loneliness deepens, even if you don't label it that way. This is why the Stoics warned not just against excess noise, but against unnecessary withdrawal. Marcus Aurelius wrote constantly, not for applause, but to prevent his own mind from collapsing inward. He understood something vital. Silence must serve clarity, not suppress truth. So what does the right kind of silence actually look like? It's silence that filters, not hides. Silence that chooses what to express, not whether to exist. It means you don't share everything, but you don't disappear either. You don't narrate your life, but you allow parts of it to be seen, not for validation, but for alignment. This kind of silence is selective. You speak when something matters. You stay quiet when it doesn't. You don't explain yourself to everyone, but you don't erase yourself for anyone either. Psychologically, this restores balance. You keep your inner depth intact while allowing the world to meet you where it can. And here's the critical shift. You stop seeing visibility as performance and start seeing it as translation. You're not showing everything. You're translating just enough. Enough to connect, enough to be known, enough to not disappear inside your own mind. This doesn't mean posting constantly. It doesn't mean becoming loud. It doesn't mean chasing attention. It means reclaiming agency. Deciding consciously, this part stays mine. This part I can share. This moment doesn't need an audience. This insight deserves expression. When silence is intentional, it becomes power. You are no longer reacting to the noise. You are choosing your signal, and that choice changes how you feel about yourself. Because one of the quietest forms of self-respect is allowing yourself to take up some space. Not all, not constantly, but truthfully. This is especially important for deep thinkers. People with rich inner worlds often underestimate the value of their expression. They assume their thoughts are too complex, too heavy, too nuanced. But complexity doesn't disappear when unspoken. It just becomes heavier to carry alone. The right silence doesn't isolate depth. It protects it while letting it breathe. And when you find that balance, something shifts internally. You feel less alienated, less invisible, less like you're living beside life instead of inside it. You don't need the crowd, but you no longer feel erased by it. That's the difference. Silence becomes grounding, not distancing. Presence becomes deliberate, not performative. And once you understand this, the final question emerges naturally. If silence can be chosen wisely, If invisibility doesn't have to mean disconnection, then how do you integrate this into daily life without losing yourself again? That's where everything comes together. That's where silence becomes a tool, not an identity. And that's what we're closing with next. At some point, silence stops being a question and becomes a choice. Not a defense, not a disappearance, but a position. And this is where everything we explored comes together. You don't need to be loud to exist. You don't need to post to be real. You don't need constant visibility to matter. But you also don't need to erase yourself to stay authentic. The people who find peace aren't the most visible, and they aren't the most invisible either. They are the most intentional. They know when to speak and when to stay quiet. They know which moments belong to them alone and which moments gain meaning when shared. They stop asking, "How will this be perceived?" and start asking, "Is this true to me?" That single shift changes everything. Because the exhaustion many people feel online is not caused by posting itself. It's caused by performing a version of yourself that isn't aligned with who you really are. When you stop performing, even silence feels lighter. And when you choose to speak, it feels grounded. This is what psychological autonomy looks like. You're no longer reacting to algorithms, no longer measuring yourself through engagement, no longer confusing attention with connection. You become quiet when you want, visible when it matters, absent when necessary, present when real, and something unexpected happens. The need to be seen fades because you finally see yourself. The fear of invisibility dissolves because your identity is no longer external. You stop living for the feed and start living inside your life again. Moments feel fuller, time slows down, relationships deepen. You notice who reaches out without updates, who remembers you without reminders, who connects without needing proof. Those connections weigh more because they aren't broadcasted. They're chosen. And this is the quiet truth most people miss. The people who don't post aren't missing out. They're opting out of a system that equates visibility with value. They're not hiding. They're preserving attention, preserving meaning, preserving a sense of self that doesn't fragment every time it's observed. This doesn't make them superior. It makes them conscious, and consciousness always comes with trade-offs. You may feel misunderstood. You may feel slightly out of place. You may feel like you're living on a different frequency. But that discomfort is often the price of depth. In a world optimized for noise, depth will always feel foreign. Yet it's also where real identity forms. Not in comments, not in metrics, not in constant expression, but in the quiet continuity of being who you are, whether anyone is watching or not. So if you've ever wondered whether choosing silence means you're falling behind or disappearing from relevance, understand this. You are not invisible. You are just no longer performing. And that distinction changes how you move through the world. If this reflection resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Not because you need more content, but because we explore ideas that aren't meant to be rushed or diluted. And before you go, leave a comment, not to explain yourself, just this. What's one thing in your life you've chosen to keep private, and why does it matter to you? Sometimes the quietest answers say the most.